I'd like to invite up our first panel, and just as all of the speakers and the moderator are making their way up, just say thank you, Minister Ballard, for joining us, for your words. There's a lot of exciting things happening in our world. I live green buildings every day. There's technical aspects, there's legal aspects, there's policy aspects, but it's a really exciting field, and we know it's a really important field. So having you on this file, where I get to benefit, being a resident of Toronto, will be great to have you. So yeah, I'd like to invite up the first panel, moderated by Bill Updike from Integral Group.
Very, very excited to be here among this esteemed group. I saw Richard Branson walking through the hallway the other day. I was like, dude, that's Richard Branson. That guy's a big deal. So I'm pretty happy to be among this group. I'm not exactly a big deal, but I'm doing some things to try to change the world a little bit in my part. My name is Bill Updike. I'm a principal with Integral Group. Integral Group is a deep green engineering company and a North American leader in net zero energy buildings, very high performance buildings. Integral Group has about 85 net zero energy projects that they either have completed or are in design right now. So they're really quite a leader in terms of net zero buildings, which is part of the subject of this panel. Prior to joining Integral Group, I used to manage green building and climate policy for the city of Washington, D.C. So don't boo, because it was the city of Washington, D.C. We sometimes get confused with the federal government. I'm glad that you didn't boo. That was good. That was very bipartisan of you not to boo. So despite what's happening in Congress and in the White House right now, I can tell you that the city of D.C., who I'm not speaking for anymore, although I keep saying we, I just started actually working with Integral Group about a month ago, so my we's and they's are a little bit confused still, but in D.C., just to make you feel better, maybe, hopefully to make you feel better, there's quite a bit of things happening at the city level. Back in 2006, D.C. was the first city in the U.S. to pass a mandatory green building law for certification. In 2008, D.C. was the first city to pass an energy and water benchmarking law. And I'm not bragging because I didn't have anything to do with those two things. I'm just telling you the history here a little bit. In 2012, we worked on a net zero energy and living building challenge financial study. And part of this panel is to talk about what the financials of these high performance buildings are and what they look like. And that financial study in DC showed a 40% return on investment for net zero buildings in DC and a simple payback inside of 3 years. So the numbers are good, the numbers are real. Part of that is because we have probably the best financials for solar in the country right now in DC. In 2014, we were the first city again, I guess, to adopt all of the mandatory chapters of the International Green Construction Code. In 2016, DC passed a new renewable portfolio standard law, which requires 50% of electricity in the District of Columbia to come from renewable sources, so that was a good accomplishment. In 2016, we also now have additional, if any of you are responding to public building projects around the country, we have additional points and additional consideration for people responding to requests for proposals in the DC government projects for those proposing net zero energy, passive house, and living building challenge. And then just in 2017, one of the things I was working on before I left was a new stretch energy code as the baseline code, as well as drafting language to create a net zero energy code. And this is a new thing for us, to actually have code language to drive buildings to net zero energy. And we have a draft climate action plan, an update to our climate action plan that should be coming out this fall. And that plan calls for all residential single-family buildings to be net zero 2020. So that net zero code, which will be, in this code cycle, a voluntary alternative compliance path, will become mandatory for single-family in 2020, and then all other buildings in 2026. So the stuff is getting real. I was good because I didn't swear there, but you get the idea. The stuff is getting real, and people need to understand that it's coming and it's here. And then one of the other things I was working on before I left the city was drafting legislation to create a green bank in D.C., because we all know that without the financing, none of this stuff is going to happen. So that's just a little summary of D.C. Hopefully that makes you feel a little bit better about what's happening in D.C., minus all that other stuff that's happening in D.C., which we just try to ignore. It's very embarrassing, and I apologize to all of the international people here. Can't say anything else, I guess. Sorry, I'm very sorry. On this panel, you're going to hear stories of subnationals that are doing some amazing things. There's some incredible leadership on this panel, and it's very exciting. In particular, being in a country where there's a national government that's failing us on the climate crisis, it's very exciting to be hearing from the subnationals and folks that know what's happening on the ground and where the real work is getting done, right, John? Okay, so I'm gonna read everyone's bios first, and then each of the panelists are going to do about 5-minute intro, and then we're going to have a conversation and discussion, and we're going to go from there. So we're going to be with Mark Chambers from the New York City Mayor's Office of Sustainability, but Mark unfortunately got pulled away by the mayor to another event and couldn't join us. But thankfully, we have an equally amazing person from the New York Mayor's Office of Sustainability, John Lee, who's a good friend of mine. And I told him I was just going to make up a bunch of stuff because I didn't see his bio before he came, because he just found out 30 minutes ago he was doing this. But I'll skip all the embarrassing stuff that we were going to do. But John is an incredible leader. He's been an inspiration for me for a number of years now in the work that I did when I was with the city government in D.C. and continues to be an inspiration now. He's really focused on the 80 by 50, the 80% carbon emissions reduction goal that New York has by 2050. And they had a very exciting announcement New York City did just last week. So John's going to talk to us a little bit about that. John is an architect and an urban planner and an all-around awesome guy, great guy to share a beer with later. So that's my bio for John. Is that good? Is that all right?
Yeah, I can do other things besides drink beer.
Oh, okay. Well, that's true. That's true. You were talking about bench pressing me that one time, so that. Apparently he has that skill too. We can be casual here, right? We don't have to be too serious. I mean, climate change is serious, but everything else should be fun. We also have, to John's right, we have Peter Torrellas, who's National Business Manager for State and Local Government from Siemens. Peter's work with Siemens and as a fellow at the Center for Neighborhood Technology leading smart city initiatives. His current focus is on building performance, water infrastructure, energy strategies, and public-private partnerships. That's a big pile of stuff you have to work on, Peter. That's impressive. He previously held the position of Chief Technology Officer at Siemens Infrastructure and Cities. His portfolio included logistics, aviation, passenger, and freight rail, ports, and road and city mobility. Peter was telling us before when we were backstage that he had worked on the whole fiber optic network that led to the timing, what do you call those?
Countdown clocks.
Counterclock in the New York City subway, which was a game changer here. So that's a pretty cool project. And then to Peter's right, we have Rainer von Loon, who's a project manager with the state of North Rhine, Westphalia Energy Agency. Rainer is responsible for projects of international climate protection and emissions trading. He initiated the membership of NRW in the States and Regions Alliance of the Climate Group and has been working intensely with a wider network. And he's going to tell us a little bit about that work here today. Rainer was trained as a mechanical engineer in building technologies. He has worked in his field in Germany and the U.S. Before he joined NRW's energy agency as an energy engineer. And then to Rainer's right, we have Sandy Pitcher. Sandy is the chief executive, commenced as the chief executive of the Department of Environment, Water, and Natural Resources in January of 2015. where she has developed a vibrant nature-based tourism strategy for South Australia, connecting people to parks and delivering on the state's ambitious climate change agenda. Sandy was the Deputy Chief Executive of the Department of the Premier and Cabinet for 5 years. She was responsible for many areas, including the South Australian Cabinet Office, the Economic Analysis Division, and the Strategic Engagement and Communications Division. So there you have it, very impressive folks here. I think we're going to start with you, John. You have the lead. And we're going to do 5-minute intros and then just have a dialogue up here.
Thanks,
Great.
Bill.
Yep.
And thank you for the eloquent introduction.
I don't think you're...
Yeah, my hot.
There you go.
There we
You're hot now.
So, and I, as the New York representative on this panel, I should certainly foremost welcome those who've come from far to the greatest city in the world. That's a fact.
That's a fact.
And Bill mentioned the announcement that was made by Mayor Bill de Blasio late last week. You may have seen in the headlines about the city to mandate aggressive greenhouse gas emissions reductions from the New York City's largest buildings. And before I get into what little detail I can give to you in 4 minutes and 45 seconds left, I do want to paint a little bit of context around how we came to this announcement, and also where we are in our trajectory towards net zero buildings. Net zero buildings is a very lofty goal, especially for us here in New York City. We are primarily a fossil fuel driven city still. We don't look like California by any stretch of the imagination. We do not have the renewables penetration into our grid. We have a nuclear power plant a few miles up the river here that is slated to be decommissioned within just a few short years, and that's going to radically change our greenhouse gas emissions profile coming from power. So that's a little bit of context of where we stand now. In June of this year, our City Council introduced a bill to advance our energy codes for buildings. It doesn't explicitly say net zero, but it does compel our future buildings to be designed to a very low energy performance standard, which starts to sound a lot like passive house or close to net zero buildings, but this certainly isn't net zero, but it does put us in a much farther and better position than we are today with respect to new construction. Around the same time earlier this year was when President Trump withdrew the United States from the Paris Climate Agreement, and Mayor de Blasio was among over 300 local and state leaders that said that we are wholly committed to the Paris Climate Agreement. So that took a couple months for staffers like myself to unpack what that actually means and to set ourselves on that trajectory to uphold that commitment. And in that is this notion of the 1.5 degree limit to global temperature rise. And that is the context in which we put out, develop our policies and put out how New York City actually is going to uphold those terms of the agreement. And again, central to this then comes to our buildings. And we are a city that is almost completely built out. I mean, we've been around since the 1600s. If you look outside the landscape, those buildings that you see, they're glorious and they're storied, but they're not going anywhere. We are a city of existing buildings. So while we can make great claims for what we can do in terms of our new construction and with our advanced codes, that's a long ways away from what we do with our existing assets. And so the central point of last Thursday's announcement from the mayor was what we're going to do in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions from our existing buildings. We have a lot of them. We have nearly 1 million buildings, and so we first looked at how we're going to address greenhouse gas emissions from our largest buildings. Our buildings overall account for more than 2/3 of our greenhouse gas emissions. That's maybe typical of many very dense urban contexts. That's atypical of an American city. But in New York City, most of our greenhouse gas emissions comes from fossil fuels that are combusted inside buildings. Over 40% of our greenhouse gas emissions come from fossil fuels combusted on site. This is natural gas and fuel oil that's used to heat our buildings and create hot water. And this is the center point of our means of addressing climate change, reducing energy consumption, and reducing overall greenhouse gas emissions. So we start with fossil fuels and the stuff that we combust inside of our buildings. And I use that term to follow Bill's suit of not using expletives. We have to stop burning fossil fuels. That is the number one part of this equation. The governor of New York has made some pretty bold commitments to renewables penetration in our grid, but even if we clean up our grid 100% renewables, unless we do something about fossil fuel combustion in our grid, we will never beat our 80% greenhouse gas reduction goal. We will never meet our commitments to limit global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees centigrade. So we start with placing energy use intensity caps for fossil fuel use consumption in our buildings. And then we follow with electricity and all the other sources that contribute to greenhouse gas emissions. But cleaning the grid, cleaning our sources is not the only part of the equation. We also have to drastically reduce energy consumption. And it's those two components of this equation that will get us to meeting our greenhouse gas reduction goals and ultimately to save the world. Thanks.
I guess we'll go with Peter next, and then Sandy, you'll be third. Yeah.
Okay. I grew up in the Bronx, so I'm happy to be here. Like all good New Yorkers, I moved to Florida, so climate change is something near and dear to my heart. Still cleaning up from Irma. One of the things that I get to do is kind of lead our strategies with state and local governments for North America. And a little bit about Siemens. We help generate 1/3 of the power in the United States. And just in our business, we've helped local governments do work in existing buildings and saved billions of dollars in energy and taken tens of thousands of cars worth of carbon inventory off the roads. So we consider ourselves more musicians and critics when it comes to the story here. We've also made a commitment, and we've made our own personal commitment to act in terms of climate change. By 2030, we've committed all of our own facilities to be net zero. We've already, I think, achieved 20% of that goal, and we've committed to at least a 50% reduction by 2020. So it's something that we take seriously in our own lives and something that we help our customers with as well. I thought the easiest way to talk about subnationals and climate action is telling you kind of a couple of stories. So with my 3 minutes, I'll tell you a little bit about Pittsburgh. We've been working with Pittsburgh for over 2 years now. One of the things that makes them really interesting is they were founded on energy, on traditional energy, with George Westinghouse and Nikola Tesla in the 1880s. And that's part of their history. And they had a really severe economic downturn. And currently, they are really leading the way nationally and globally in thought leadership when it comes to climate action and resiliency. And it's not about fear. For them, it's really about economic development. They see climate action and working in their buildings and working, with their energy profile in order to drive the new economy that the city will live off of, and to drive diversity in their economy and to improve people's lives. And that's their number one focus. The mayor always says, if it's not for all of us, it's not for us. And so what makes things, I think, noteworthy about what they've done is, what we see a lot of times is climate action and climate leadership doesn't always have the opportunity to survive budget cycles and administrative cycles. And so what we see subnationals doing more and more and more effectively is building stickiness in the community. Building stickiness in terms of working with academic institutions, NGOs. In the case of Pittsburgh, they have some great not-for-profits and foundations like the Heinz Foundation, Mellon Foundation, and with the private sector. So that stickiness in the community with all of the major anchor institutions and actors moving together is able to provide really long-term change. In their case, they're also working with their utilities, both in power generation and power transmission and distribution, and taking a look inward. So sometimes cities have policies about building standards, but if you look at their own buildings, there's still a bit of work to do. So they have an internal view and an external view. I think that's really something that should be modeled and that we see really working when you're trying to attain these goals. I think if you look at places like California, the real leadership and a real economic engine, real climate change is happening on that local government level. And I think you'll probably see more and more local governments driving that change, not only in the face of federal seizure in terms of being able to act, but that's where the people are, right? That's where the density is, that's where the fuel is being consumed, that's where the air quality issues are. And so it's on that ground level and on that ground game that we see real movement as far as climate action. And we're happy to support cities all around the country really drive those changes in their new buildings, in their existing buildings, and within their energy infrastructure.
Thank you. Awesome. Well, Sandy, please take it away.
Hi everyone, I'll see if this works. The pretty pictures are to distract you from my very croaky voice, so apologies in advance for that. I want to tell you the story, firstly, of South Australia's energy plan, because I think the three messages I take from it are exactly the messages that I put towards where we're going now with building in the built form and getting towards our goals of net zero by 2050 and to be the world's first carbon neutral city of Adelaide. That's our aspiration. So Adelaide is a city of about 1 million people, and we're a city-state really in South Australia. We don't have very many more people living in our region, but we're a very big part of Australia. And we have a mix of renewable energy that hovers between 43 and 46% at the moment. So we have no coal anymore in our grid. We are solar, wind and gas, and we are moving towards having, with the help of Mr. Elon Musk, the world's largest battery coming within 100 days or it's free, and check out Twitter if that didn't mean anything to you. And we are also moving towards having, with the partnership of Solar Reserve, Australia's first solar thermal plant, which the government has played a big role in. So we are known for renewables. Renewables has been a very big part of our climate change story. And like has been happening in the States, there has been real attacks on renewables in Australia, and we had a particularly severe storm come through South Australia, and we had a blackout for 1 day. And I know many of you in New York had 6 days, but 1 day in South Australia sort of nearly brought down renewables because the attacks were just so ferocious against renewables, and that this was causing sort of chaos in the nation. And what we could have done was run away, but what we did was continue on our course, and it's the stickiness that we're talking about and the leadership that I think was so important in South Australia's climate action. And the things that the three messages of our energy focus are what we're now putting to buildings. And for me, what state governments, regional governments can do, you've got lots of levers, but the strongest ones are policy and regulation, number one. The laws that you make and the laws that you write are what people need to follow, and you can set a lot of frameworks that way. Secondly, you can use procurement. The dollars that we spend, and I know this is the lesson from Siemens and others, is that governments spend a lot of money. We don't have a lot of money spare because it's already being put to things, but we actually spend a lot. So we've been looking at where we put that money and how we move it. And for both the Solar Reserve solar thermal plant and for the battery, that was moving the entire electricity load of the state government, putting it out to procurement and seeing what the market delivered. And that's how we're going to be able to get to 100% renewables very, very quickly using existing money that we were doing. So 1, policy and regulation. 2, using your money, using your procurement that you already do. And then the third is leadership. And it's standing the course when things get tough. It's embedding everything into your policy. It's having leaders from your politicians, your public servants, your community leaders who understand the story and are part of that story. And that's what we've been talking about today. So for in buildings and the built form, if we're going to be the world's first carbon neutral city, we better get on with it. And built form in Adelaide is a huge part for us. So we're following those three things. We have made some new legislation called Building Upgrade Finance, or BUF, for those of you who like a good acronym. And the Building Upgrade Finance is really just a way of enabling building owners and tenants to share in the incentives of upgrading buildings. And I'm happy to answer more about that later, but it's the legislation part. Secondly, we're putting financial incentives there. We're putting renewable energy funds into the market and asking people to come with us. We're looking at our housing stock that we own as a government and putting panels, batteries and other things there. We're looking at carbon neutral precincts across our city and putting seed funding and money into technology and building the smart city. And then the third thing, again, is leadership. So in my building, the Department of Environment, we managed to get a 6-star upgrade to our formerly C-grade building, which is bad building. We worked with the building owner and we were just stubborn. We said, we're just not going to move into this building until we can get it to 6-star. We managed to save $30 million over 6 years by being clever and smart and being there at the front. So those three messages for our energy plan are the three messages for how I think we can make a real difference in the built form in our cities and our towns. Thanks.
Great, thank you. That's awesome. Beautiful. And Rainer, you're up next.
Yeah, thanks. I want to answer to what was said about New York, and it's certainly true about, all cities in the developed world, which is that a lot of, most energy in those buildings is being used for heating purposes and heating up of sanitary water. And so while the standards for new buildings reach a level that we can really call satisfactory, the old buildings are really our big challenge. And when you walk around, especially attractive cities like New York or London, Paris, you name it, maybe they're a little less great than New York, but however, they all have the same, they look the same in terms of, you still see buildings that have single pane windows, you see poor air conditioning units, you see the snow melting on the roof, and building owners don't invest. If somebody develops the site, they tear the building down and build a new one. But the building owners, they don't have to invest. Why? Because it is attractive enough. Tenants come and they pay. And so they just make money with the building, and they don't put a lot of it back into the building, at least not for a long time. So legislation is absolutely true, is a key. And another key is to find out, what can we do to tackle this problem? How can we work together to do something about it? And that's why I wanted to today tell you about a project that we do under the leadership of the Climate Group. And I'm part of this project. Our region in the center, in the west of Germany, is a heavy industrialized region. So we have many issues that we work on, but of course a big stock of old buildings is one of them. And this is one of the topics that we brought into this project, and we call this project the Energy Transition Platform. And it is a project where we're trying to intensely exchange tools and policy measures in the climate field with other regions worldwide. There are regions like California or Minnesota, South Australia, and others that we occasionally meet with, but most of this project is happening via emails, webinars, and phone conferences and these kind of things, and that is another challenge that we share, because to meet and intensely work together in one room for a day is really much more than talking for hours on the phone with sometimes people you haven't met before. But the climate group has done great work in structuring the project and defining the different phases that we work in. We had a peer forum phase where we kind of learned about each other's approaches, and right now we have the laboratory phase where we go into detail and we try to really look at things precisely and look at the framework conditions that we have. Each jurisdiction is different, and see if a project can be carried over to another region that has similar problems. We hope that in the future we can have a follow-up project that is much bigger in size, in terms that we want to incorporate many more regions worldwide. We have the Under 2 coalition that has been talked about here before. That would be the target group to do this, and it's really a fantastic project to be a part of. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So I'm gonna be a mean moderator. You know, on some of these panels, sometimes we like develop questions in advance, so everybody's prepped and prepared, and I'm just gonna throw all those out, and we're gonna improv through this. Hopefully that's good. You good, John?
It was improv from the beginning.
All right. Good. So if you were king or queen for a day, and you had the magic wand, what would be the 1 to 3 policy initiatives that you think would be the most impactful to getting from where we are today to carbon neutrality or net zero carbon buildings? Starting with you, John. Or anybody, whoever wants to jump in. I don't want to put John on the spot, though. You look like you wanted to say something.
No, the only thing I was wanting to say, especially for our international guests, it's a little bit of an unfair question because we don't live in the totalitarian state, right?
We're getting that. We're going that direction, though. So, maybe it'll come up. You know, we could say benevolent dictatorship. Maybe we could say that.
Yeah, I don't even want that. I've spent fair enough of my time in totalitarian governments, and dictatorships don't end up
okay.
well.
You could say just an elevated sense of power.
And so in the elevated sense of power, right? And if we could move things, number one is just this: it is within us to do something about it, right? I think there have been a number of panels already today to talk about the business case to be made, and this is something that we reiterate all the time, and yet it does not happen. And so in this town, which is the world capital of finance and business, yet we still have not come to that collective conclusion that this should be done. So our mayor made an announcement of moving towards mandates, and the time is now. There are a number of events that led to this confluence of why it has to be now, and a lot of it is pushed by the urgency of what our best science has shown, and that we're seeing exhibited almost on a weekly basis now on the very shores of this country. Right? So it's not that there is any lack of knowledge around this, or that the means of achieving it are outside of our sight or outside even of our technology. It is a matter of just understanding that it has to be done and to adopt the will to do something about it right now. And I say right now, it might mean tomorrow, it might be within 5 years from now, but there is a decision-making that has to happen, and we have to build this into our business processes, and we don't. And it's because we have accepted this idea of a free ride on pollution for hundreds of years, and it is now coming to the point of where we have to own up to it. Is there a cost to this? Yes, absolutely there is a cost. Is there a return on that investment? Most cases there is. In some extreme cases there aren't, but there is. If you look beyond the 5-year or 7-year return and begin to think of in 20, 30-year time horizons, there is a stronger and stronger business case to be made here. The time for action is now, and we have to be able to make these decisions. So if I could waive something and say everyone understands this and makes the right choices, that would be great. But we don't have that that sort of wizard power at our disposal. It is about building awareness. Part of it comes from marketing. Part of it comes from these kind of panels themselves. But also part of it has to come from mandates that this is something that we must do.
I would like to
please, Rainer, jump in.
Respond. I find the king aspect very interesting because if somebody was king, say like you would not have to care about being re-elected.
Right.
Of course, you would be king by nature,
Yeah.
and you wouldn't care about lobby groups. You would just rule, and you would raise the bar and say, hey, in about, say, 30 years' time, existing buildings have to be carbon neutral. I assume that the technologies will be there. I assume that the money will be there. Otherwise, I'll give you some. And now this is what you're going to have to do. And that will be easy.
Yeah.
But that's not how it works.
We'll say a little bit more about that political challenge. Maybe you can jump in as you're invested in that in South Australia.
I am. Well, I was going to
challenge.
say my magic wand would be 100% renewables because that would solve or get us to a place. But taking the point that other people have, you don't actually change people's hearts and minds unless they're engaged in understanding what the renewables are. So I still have that desire to actually get people to be making the choices and the positive action and using the business cases that we don't necessarily see. Sometimes there are so many choices, whether it be energy efficiency in buildings or people making the choice for a hybrid car, and they're not doing the long game, they're just doing the old habits, and that's always very confounding to me, but we know it's the case. So my magic wand would get us to 100% renewables, but I'd also like to do a bit of brainwashing while I was there.
Peter, do you have something?
Yeah, when we see climate action plans and climate goals or even building standards, one of the things, Siemens is also a commercial bank. So we wind up getting deeply involved in the commercial structures and models around acquiring energy. And I can tell you for most cities of almost all sizes, I mean, we do towns and villages and counties and states, how to acquire the procurement process for energy efficiency or renewable energy it's awkward. There's not a lot of standardization in terms of education and awareness. Most procurement departments are designed to buy commodities. So if they want to buy toilet paper, it works really well. If they want to buy a complex energy project, that's a little bit of a heavier lift. And while we've done a lot of them, and there are many good examples, it's still, we have 35,866 local governments in the United States. There's still a lot of standardization around procurement that needs to happen for the acquisition, not the money, but the acquisition of the assets to occur. The other thing I think would be interesting is, and we see it the beginning of it, but I think if it were more standard, it would be a little bit easier. Elected officials don't get reelected for changing out boilers. But when you add a community...
That would be amazing.
Yeah, it would be cool, but no.
Not going to happen.
I haven't seen it yet. But what we do see is when you have good leadership, they tie climate action and building infrastructure and energy infrastructure directly to community benefits. And in some cases now we're seeing community benefits specified as part of the procurement process. And I think the change that we're talking about is a generational change. One quick example, we did a project where on a capped landfill, we put in a solar array. And the elected officials were really concerned about getting the message out, and we wound up creating a STEM education program where kids in the K-12 schools were building solar kits. And we tied that to the project. So you could see direct community benefit. They don't get reelected for changing out boilers, but they do have constituents who find education and all of those workforce development issues that are tied to these infrastructure projects. Those mean something. People understand that. You can get down to like a Got Milk commercial for climate action if you realize the interdependency between the community benefit for the individual and then and tie it to the infrastructure.
So, we waved the magic wand for a second there, and that was great. That was really helpful. So let's say we don't have the magic wand, which we don't. Well, I don't know, John, you might have a little of a magic wand, but you know, what do we, part of this conversation is around the business proposition or the value proposition. And when I first started in the DC government, I came from the private sector, from working for a renewable energy company, and I thought, you know, I should start developing all these market-based policies, and we don't need all these laws. And you know, I was coming from that sort of mentality, right? And then you know, after a couple of years, I was like, we really need to legislate this stuff because it's just not happening otherwise. But in the meantime, before we have the magic wand, what's your pitch? How do you make let's say you have a developer, you know, a big real estate developer who's sitting on the other side of this panel right now. What's the pitch to them towards driving towards net zero energy or carbon buildings now instead of waiting until it gets mandated later?
You know, I reckon there's something, you know, for many of us who are parents and try and get kids to do things that they don't want to do, the best way to do it is if the kid thought it was their idea, you know, the brainwashing thing again. So for me...
I hope there are no developers in the room right now. You're not really
I'm quite
children.
open about this because I
hypothetical,
think
right?
if you can legislate to a base so that you're sort of stopping criminal activity and things not happening below, but if you can incentivise for change, that perfect case is when the developer comes to us in government and says, you know, I want to make this community and I want to make it this amount of livable, and if you remove this regulation and this, but give us this and this incentive, we can do it. And that is where we've seen the transformations, where it's actually been developer-led or industry-led, and even, you know, if they thought it was their idea, that's fantastic too. And I think it's finding that magic place, because governments aren't always great at predicting what that should be, but we're definitely good at knowing what a fair playing field and a baseline should be, and not enabling people to sort of, I think, sink below that. So that's my perfect world of how you can get the best out of regulation and incentives. And the way that it works is if that's where people want to buy and live. You know, if you make the development that's walkable, livable, clean, safe, carbon neutral, that sort of should be the marketer's dream.
John, what do you think? I mean, New York is probably the most serious, you know, developers in the U.S. at least. You know, how do you pitch it to them?
I'm not sure if I can pitch it in one uniform message, right? It depends on who you're talking to, and I say this because it's how you approach development and the ownership of property, and what you do with it, and what your investment choices and your strategy in the long term is about. I think when I was younger and started this job, I probably had the same naive belief as you about, you know, if we can change the market, then we change the world. And that's probably indicative of how old both of us are, because they don't teach that in school, this perfect market theory anymore, because everyone knows it's just a load of bull. People make irrational decisions all the time, even when you're given all the best information. And as I said, we are home to the capitals of finance, and you know, none of them are climate change denialists. Everyone uses market information to the best of their capacity. They may vocally be denying it because it goes against their business interests, but there is no doubt in my mind that they have the best science at their disposal, and you can see when it does actually affect their business decisions, especially when they take a long-term look on it. When we look at our owner developers that know they'll be sitting on their asset for 30 years, going to be in their family for 50 years longer, they do make these choices on their own accord without us having to aggressively push them. Whereas those other investors who are in and out in less than 700 days do not care about this, and they are always looking for the cheapest route with the highest profits at the back end of it. Which is fine. That's the way that we do business. But again, as I said before, it does not account for all the externalities and the costs that are associated with it, because it comes down to then the cost of energy, which is super cheap, which is not necessarily a bad thing either, right? We want energy to be cheap because it has allowed this country to become the global economy, the world's leader in the economy, and maybe it was born on the back of zero-cost externalities that we might have to pay for later. But right now, as it is, we can make the case as long as we make the long-term business case for it. If that is not in the interest of the owner, developer, investor, whatever have you, then they're never going to account for it.
I always wondered why they don't have an energy-oriented development. I mean, they solve this problem for transportation, right? They have the TOD models to incentivize and quantify the mutual benefit for developers. And I think you can make the same case for energy and have an EOD model.
Yeah, totally. Rainer, I think you're going to have the last word if you'd like it.
Well, I think when I come across projects, this might concern a new building or an old building. I sometimes find it amazing that people tend to reinvent the wheel. And at another private visit here in New York, I took some time to visit the Empire State Building, which has been worked on extensively, and it's was pretty amazing what they have done to the building. And there's so much manpower that goes to in a single project like that, although you have many buildings that are not the same, but they are alike, and not in the city alone, in other cities and around the world. And that is the same with new buildings. What we do need to see is more exchange, more networking, more toolboxes, more easy to get to information that will show me as an engineer or architect how have others done that, how have they come to the solution. And this has to happen in a framework. And we need leaders that say, that give us political goals and say, this is the direction where we want to go. And I think it's very interesting what we heard from South Australia here, and I want to look deeper into that, to come up with a legislation that makes tenants and building owners work together. And this is something that we also have thought about. It's tricky, it's complicated. How can you incentivize people so both parties gain? We are in this together, so we need to go together.
I love it. We're in this together. That's a great last statement. Please join me in thanking the panelists.